think what's clear to everybody is that we are in a brave new world, and it affects both national security and peace building. It's a disruption that we've seen throughout the economy and our society. We're getting used to it in recent years. Our first panelist, I'm very honored to introduce. He is an icon of national security in the United States. He served as National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, and is serving now as the chairman of the USIP. So, Stephen, how has the landscape of national security changed as you have watched it in real time over these last decades with so much new technology?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the multiplicity of actors. Particularly when the international system was built after World War II, it was the province of states, and the issue was how do states regulate their affairs. But of course, since that time, you've seen an explosion of non-state actors, some of them for ill, terrorist groups, traffickers of various kinds, organized crime, but some positive in terms of companies and civil society and non-government organizations. And that's kind of what you saw in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What's largely, I think, the result of technology now is that individuals, empowered and enabled individuals, are playing even on international issues. And that really is because of technology and what technology has done to give people voice and then to connect people in the way that we've just described. And that really has transformed the landscape of how you deal with so-called international or national security problems. You know, when I was in the government, we thought about everything in terms of top-down. You know, what were the governments going to do and try to affect things on the ground? And we did not pay enough attention to what's happening on the bottom up, how organizations and individuals empowered by technology can play. And indeed, if you're going to either avoid conflict or take a conflict and resolve it on a sustaining basis. You know, everybody focuses on, well, let's get the key parties together and have a peace conference. Well, what you really need to do is deal with the underlying tensions, the underlying grievances, the underlying tensions between ethnic groups, religious groups, and the like, that provide a grievance ground that could result in conflict, or once you have resolved the conflict and the fighting stops, you need to address those things if that peace is going to be sustainable. And that's a whole different world. That is the bottom-up world, and is a world where technology can be an enormous tool for individuals and groups to try to breach those divides, and in some sense re-knit up the social fabric, so either places do not fall into conflict, or if they have fallen into conflict and you've gotten the fighting to stop, how you can have a sustainable peace. So it's a different landscape. It goes all the way down to empowered individuals, and that bottom-up activity is heavily facilitated by the technologies we're talking about today.
Now, as the beneficiary of the old framework of national security that guided a generation through a Cold War that didn't end up turning into a World War, are you optimistic about the uses of technology? We've seen some of the downsides. Certainly, Jean Kirkpatrick had looked at this tribal approach, terrorism coming. She didn't know about how technology would play into that. As you look forward, what kind of hope do you have, and what kind of concern do you have, knowing that Nick says happy days are here again?
It's good.
I think the key element of bridging these divides is getting to people to communicate, getting understanding, getting people to, in some sense, put themselves in somebody else's shoes. That isn't, I'm not a kumbaya person, this is not a panacea, but it is an element of the solution. And to the extent that technology can enable that, it seems to me it can only have a positive impact. Now, we've seen the abuses we talked about in the prior panel. You've also seen the abuses by governments. When this technology exploded, exploded on the scene 10 years ago, I was very optimistic. I thought that would be a force for democratization by empowering individuals against their governments and able to check their governments. And what we found, particularly in places like China, is governments have been quite adept at controlling the technology, containing it in their space, intimidating people off some of these platforms in terms of organization or political discussion. That said, I think it is still the case that particularly in this bottom-up world of conflict resolution, that the technology is on balance going to be an enormous positive.
Okay, and Nancy, you are in the field of peace building, and Nancy Lindborg is the president of USIP. She's been with USAID. You've spent your lifetime working in peace building. So on the other side of it, the landscape of peace building has changed due to technology. How have you watched that change take place, and what are your hopes for how we can use it in the future?
Thank you, Megan. Great to have you here on stage. I would build on a lot of what Steve just said in terms of the multipolar, multi-stakeholder world that has driven the conflicts of the last, I would almost decade. And in fact, we're seeing a rise in conflict deaths from those kinds of civil wars, conflicts that are on average lasting longer than they used to. And emanating from countries where there is very low legitimacy of the state in the eyes of the citizens, and or they just don't have the ability to provide essential services. And so, as Steve said, the empowered individual can use this technology more adeptly, both for enabling greater resilience within their communities, but also to be a greater perpetrator of problems in a state where you do not have the systems that are resilient to those kinds of encroachments. So a good example is Burma, where we have seen, or Myanmar, where we have seen the spread of virulent hate speech by nationalists, particularly nationalist Buddhist monks, and others who are really creating a sense within that country of great hate for particularly the Muslim, and we've seen it with the Rohingya crisis. And so the question is, as we heard in the earlier panel, how do you counter the misuse of technology that ends up creating greater grievance and greater divides and conflicts by also, as Nick indicated, empower those individuals who want to do good with the technology. And so the technology has both accelerated development gains that were unimaginable a decade ago, and at the same time created a different kind of grievance that in the peace building field you really need to be cognizant of the hate speech and some of the other technology challenges and counteract that.
Well, you gave me two good examples when we were talking earlier that made me feel better, because I think in America now we do understand that some of what goes on in social media is attacking the institutions of democracy, and that is of concern. But you talked about how the resolution of the Cold War was actually facilitated by a technology that almost seems a little quaint today, teleconferencing.
Well, I was just, we're seeing that we have the rise of great power competition again. And when Megan and I were talking, I was reflecting back to the 80s, where in the waning days of the Cold War, there was a hopeful rise of people connecting to people way before Facebook. And some of you may have been around and remember there was the use of satellite technology to create this very innovative way for people in Russia or the Soviet Union to talk to people in San Francisco, where you were, it was basically just a video hookup, but it was a big deal. It was called the Big Satellite Conference. And, we obviously have moved beyond that with all of the technologies that are now available. But the concept is fundamentally the same. And it's fundamentally, as we heard Joel say, enabling people to understand and to connect one another. You know, the fundamentals of peace building are dialogue, facilitation, mediation, enabling people to use their words to solve differences before they become violent.
And then getting back to this idea of building up democratic institutions, you gave me an example in Kenya where there was a court system. I believe it was a Kenya anecdote where the court system was tied up so much that people would have to go to the courthouse every single day to try to just get a title to a land property. And technology changed that completely and restored faith in the judiciary and the courts.
That's right. I mean, it was a very Dickensian system where files were floor to ceiling, paper that had generations of unresolved land conflicts, and that deeply undermines the confidence that a citizen has in his or her government. And so simply by putting all of that on a computerized online system, it cut through what had been generations of delay and obfuscation, and that kind of transparency can be transformative.
So, happy days are here again with technology. Now I have Colin, who is from Silicon Valley. Colin Rule is a co-founder of Moderator, which was a disruption of mediation. His company, he lived the dream, was bought, and he's now with the parent company, Tyler. But really why we have him on the panel today is to talk about the perspective of Silicon Valley.
Sure.
About the uses of technology. And, you know, we're all East Coast people talking about national security and peace building. When they're over there in Silicon Valley in your garages and things, what are you all...
We love our garages, that's true.
Are you all thinking about, you know, the uses of this technology and the possible peace dividend?
Well, absolutely. I'm more than happy to be the generic Silicon Valley high-tech CEO for the purposes of this panel.
What are they
Obviously,
thinking over there?
I spend a lot of time thinking about conflict resolution and technology, but I have friends at Facebook, I have friends at Google, and you know, I think there is a Silicon, and in terms of new tools for shattering old assumptions, I think that's what Silicon Valley, that's our business. We are in the disruption business. And technology has disrupted law, it's disrupted medicine, it's disrupted finance, and now it's disrupting international relations. It's disrupting government. And I think, Steve, what you said is absolutely right. Any one of us can pull a phone out of our pockets and start communicating with people all over the world. And I think nerds like me, we like to build tools. We like to innovate. We have a lot of faith in innovation. So I think one of the things that Sheldon said is the solution is more tech. It's more innovation. The instinct is always, in terms of the status quo, the old guard. Ooh, this is disrupting things. Let's slow it down. Let's fight this. Let's resist it. And that's not the Silicon Valley orientation. We're focused on the new thing. It's always about what's coming next. And it's not even about the challenge in terms of peace tech today. It's about where we're going to go. You know, we're having hearings over on Capitol Hill where they're bringing Zuckerberg in to talk about, you know, some personality test that, you know, Cambridge Analytica ran on Facebook 6 years ago. I mean, guys, that's an old challenge. The privacy debate is pretty much over in Silicon Valley. That horse is out of the barn. I don't want to be too much of a naysayer about it, but you know, much worse stuff has happened since 2008. You know, the privacy stuff is way down the road. You want to tell us about it? Well, again, as a generic high-tech CEO from Silicon Valley, why don't I not talk about that? I might be a little less diplomatic than Joel because I'm not in government relations, but I mean, the point is there is a lot of cynicism in Silicon Valley about government's ability to do anything.
Yeah, now, how do they see themselves vis-a-vis a nation state when they've got maybe more followers than some countries have citizens?
That's exactly right. If you count up the 2 billion people at Facebook, that's the biggest country in the world. Now, it's not the same thing as a country. But, you know, if you look at the innovations that are coming out of Silicon Valley, you look at Bitcoin, you look at machine learning, you look at smart contracts. We're building new institutions where code is the law. And the nation states are not leading the interaction of citizens on the global stage. The citizens are leading themselves and self-organizing. Now, again, as a nerd, we're excited about innovation. There's so many great possibilities that this technology represents. It increases connection. You know, Facebook is a perfect example of that. All the stories, the stats that Joel shared about friends and connections between India and Pakistan and Israel and Palestine, these connections are essential to essentially preventing violence from breaking out. If you look at the places where the violence is worse, it's places that are cut off. You know, it's North Korea. I mean, I was in the Peace Corps in Eritrea. Eritrea is completely cut off. So if we can build those connections, that is an advantage. And look at Portal right outside in the square there.
Right, Portal.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. It's on the other
That's
side
Brian's
of you.
portal.
But, you know, you can get in there, and we're chatting with women in Afghanistan. I mean, that is a powerful aspect of technology. Also, opportunity and education. People can join the global marketplace because now all they need to do is plug into the internet.
Okay.
But I'll just say one more thing. What we should really be talking about is big data. What we should really be talking about is machine learning. The singularity is barreling down the road, and it's coming at us. And obviously, ground truth is a big part of that. But we're going to get to the point where the machines are so smart and so capable. We need to give them the data that can help us tackle this problem at almost a existential level. And I think that those kinds of challenges, I don't feel governments are really talking about. Silicon Valley, that's our daily bread. But the institutions used to represent us on the global stage, they're not really there. They're not thinking about those problems in the same way that we are.
What should they do? Should they think about it? Should they engage?
Well,
We're trying to
I'm
right
still
now.
a generic high-tech Silicon Valley CEO, right? So my attitude is, really, we're kind of ignoring a lot of what's going on the nation-state basis. If the United States can't get its act together and can't come up with a policy to ask these big questions and make progress on them, well, that's fine. If I'm at Google and if I'm at Facebook or I'm at LinkedIn, I'll open headquarters in Beijing. I'll open headquarters in Bangalore. That works for me, too. Innovation is global, and it's as global as the internet is. So I think what we need to do is we need to think about tackling these problems. We have to build where the highway is going, not where the highway is. And that means we need to think about things like it's got to be global. We've got to leverage code. We've got to leverage data. We have to create markets. We have to create incentives, not rules and regulations. You can't slow this down. We have to innovate our way out of it, as opposed to saying, whoa, 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 we don't like this disruption. We're going to fight it.
Okay, so you talked about the profit motive, and I know you're innovators, but you're also businesses.
That's right.
And the profit that these Macedonians were gaining by pushing negative messages wasn't something they'd get if they were pushing positive messages, as I understand it. So isn't there an inherent problem, at least with social media, that the negative is actually economically incentivized?
So, again, generic high-tech CEO, you're thinking about this wrong. We build tools, right? Our high-tech companies, we build better telephones. We build better telegraphs. We build better megaphones. Now, if someone uses my megaphone to say something bad, is that my responsibility? Do you want me, my 20,000 employees in Silicon Valley, to be governing the speech of 2 billion people around the world? Again, this is not necessarily my orientation, but I think this is the Silicon Valley orientation, which is, yes, we are in the business model of making tools that go out into the world, and innovation is inevitable. If you tell me not to invent a tool, somebody else is going to invent that tool. The innovation, we have to learn how to use the innovation to create the behavior that we want, and that's incentives. So it's not a matter of Facebook putting in rules to eliminate all the hate speech, because Facebook's not going to be able to do that. What we need to do is we need to create new technologies that can tackle the root causes exactly.
Okay, I'm going to get to Brian because Stephen
He said
is itching
everything
to
that I was
jump
gonna
in.
say,
No, we're getting you, Brian. He set you
I'm
up.
just kidding.
So, no, on this whole idea of profit motive and the fact that you all are businesses, we have multinationals now going into emerging markets. One of the threats to those companies would be conflict. We have data analytics to predict when that conflict's going to happen. Could we create an industry and a business imperative for helping us with peace? I know we have some slides because SAP is actually doing a little peace tech already around the world.
Yeah, we don't call PeaceTech, but I'd say we're doing some of those things already.
Yeah. But that's the frame we're trying to take to some of these initiatives. Tell us about what SAP is doing around the world
So,
using
I don't
technology.
know, do we have that slide? Anybody? No, that's not the slide. Maybe that's some other slides. Is that you, Colin?
You know, that was
You looked
Colin in
great back then.
Eritrea.
Thanks. Yeah, I look exactly the same. I know.
Well,
His Peace Corps days before he went to the garage.
yeah.
They have garages.
And we have another slide up here, but it'll come up while you're talking, Brian. Go ahead.
Okay, well, from an SAP perspective, we really transitioned our company to what we call a mission-driven company. So we don't talk as much about the technology we're creating. We don't talk as much about the bits and the bytes. Oh, look, there's one of them. But we talk more about the outcomes, right? And we talk about these outcomes in ways that make a big difference to the world. So what you see flipping through here are a couple of different slides that are stories that we highlight. Thank you. Stories that we highlight that talk about the story, right? The result, kind of what we're trying to get to. And if I go back, the first one's about cleaner water, right? So what we used to talk about with cleaner water is we would say, we implemented a really cool piece of technology based on data analytics and machine learning that helped to save a bunch of money and allowed you to do something different. But instead, what we're talking about now is making water cleaner, right? Taking the water in India and empowering people to make that water cleaner by making sure the pipes are fixed and the leaks are identified. I think you'll see that moving forward with a lot of our solutions. There's also stories around how we help to allow communities to respond to emergencies quicker. So in Japan, we created a mobile app, right? And the mobile app was a smartphone that actually had embedded into it, as all our smartphones do, gyroscopes. And you can take that smartphone, you can put it on a building, and you can actually get information out of it. And in Japan, that information is really critical, right? Because if you're looking at a small quake, you can understand how those bigger quakes will respond. So instead of talking about the smartphone app, we now talk about making ourselves safer, right? Making those communities safer, understanding and detecting what's happening with those quakes so that we can prevent it next. Now, it's all based on data analytics and machine learning, but it's really the outcome that we're focused on today. And we do that really to communicate with our investors, our employees, and everybody that could be a potential customer of ours to let them know that we're not just looking at this from a tech perspective, we're looking at this from making a difference and trying to empower people around the world to change through technology.
And could there be could we monetize peace? Could there be a profit motive for these kinds of projects that are advancing peace because they're addressing those factors that we know create conflict?
Well, I don't know that we're going to ever monetize peace. That'd be awesome if we could, right? But I don't know that we'll ever monetize peace, but I think this is the closest you'll get to it, which is people care about what businesses are doing more and more every day now. They care about it because governments are stepping back or they're not playing as much of an active role. And we really see a gap there from a large software perspective to play a role that can help to make a difference. So I think in our marketing, in our storytelling, in the ways in which we get resources internally to try to invest in these things that make a difference, that's as close as you're going to get to profit-driven peace.
Well, I disagree with that a little bit. Yeah. I think we can monetize peace. I think we need to take peace as inefficiency. War is bad for markets. I think that Thomas Friedman talked about, no two countries that make a component that go into a Dell laptop will ever go to war against each other. So we just have to make sure every country in the world is making a component for a Dell laptop.
All right. Well, not to get too off the subject, but this is where you get into a single currency, cryptocurrency, blockchain,
Absolutely.
And the connective tissue that's coming down the road that we all see will be there. I mean, the future state it's already there.
And I would say tech companies want peace and justice. It's just that's not our business model. We're not getting paid to create peace and justice. But we understand that right now, the disruption is creating a Wild West. And we need to civilize that Wild West. We need to build new institutions. And we're happy to partner on the creation of those institutions. But they're not going to look like the old institutions. It's going to be something new.
Like PeaceTech?
PeaceTech, exactly. That's exactly what it is. And we don't even know what it's going to look like. We don't know what the AIs are going to have us be doing in 20 years. But we need to invent them so they can tell us.
But you all have been through this. You've seen disruptions of industries, and you see what comes to replace them, and you see the imperative to scale. Where would you say this idea of a peace technology industry that would either be a balance to the military-industrial complex or maybe a part of it, because it's all national security, do you see, are we on track to building that and responding in a nimble way?
You want to go ahead?
Sure.
Start.
Well, it's funny, at dinner last night we were talking about this exact thing. I think we need to make markets. We need to create a market for peace tech. I think right now, we're all talking about peace is a great thing. Everyone says, oh, we all love peace. But we need to make peace tech mean something that people who write big checks are willing to say, I need to buy that. And I think that is what the PeaceTech Lab is here to do, is to create ideas and innovations and solve problems for the world that we can actually put a dollar price tag on. And I think Ground Truth is a perfect example of that. There are businesses that are willing to write checks because that solves a problem for them. And we need to continue to redefine peace as a problem to be solved, which we can put a price tag on that people will pay us. If we can create that market, this is self-sustaining and it'll change the world.
And reinsurance companies, by the way, have been doing this for a long time.
That's exactly right.
And conflict has become more important in what they assess for a business. So, Stephen, you wanted to jump in earlier, and I should have let you.
I was just going to try to put, in response to your comments, yours and the panel we saw before. I accept your view about what is the focus, rightly, the innovation focus, the next thing out of Silicon Valley. But I think the prior panel suggested that the industry is recognizing that they have some responsibility for consequences, and that the public, which are, again, ultimately their users, are going to insist on it. And so the industry is in the process of defining what is their level of responsibility, individually and collectively as an industry. And my argument would be, we say at USIP, peace is a problem that you need to solve from the top down, bottom up, and the inside out. Everybody's got to play in this. And I would say, don't wait for governments. Respond to the public. Take some responsibility for trying to deal with some of the negative consequences. Do so if your antitrust lawyers will let you on a cooperative basis. And the more you can reorient it towards it is more mission-driven and outcome-driven, and seeing technology as a tool for outcomes that benefit folks, the better. It seems to me those two trends together are going to shape the industry in a very positive and healthy way, and will allow the industry to be a positive force on a whole range of social issues, including peacemaking.
Well, if I make one point, sorry, go ahead.
Well, just because I was having a similar thought to Steve, it must be the East Coast thing, even though I lived on the West Coast for a while. But
Or it might be a woman thing.
the big disruption, to use your framing, that a lot of folks are talking about is the rattling of the international liberal world order, which has created a lot of the normative values that have enabled us to avoid the kind of state-to-state conflict that ripped us so apart in the last century. And if you take the way that you're framing it, Colin, and we're going to move governments aside, we're going to disrupt. I mean, that's not a value-free proposition. And there needs to be a faster pace on creating the values and the normative institutions that would guide that being for good versus the misuse that we do see already in a lot of places. My example about Burma, there's many others. ISIS was a very adept user of technology. And so I would suggest that there needs to be a big, hard push on creating the normative value basis, not just a market approach, not just an incentive approach for moving some of these technologies out. Also at a time where we're seeing a steep rise in authoritarian systems. That's going in the wrong direction. We're seeing a closing of democratic space. And as Steve said, the misuse of some of these AI and security technologies to further repress and control the citizenry.
And in poor Colin's defense, he's actually part of an effort at Stanford to do just that. He's writing.
Let me be clear. I'm playing the role of a high-tech CEO in Silicon Valley, but you're singing my song here, Nancy. No, I mean I 100% agree with you. But I guess what I'm arguing is we need to think in a forward-looking, innovative way, as opposed to trying to resist these things and bring us back to institutions we understand. We need to invent the future. Yeah. And right now, the technologies that Silicon Valley has been created are being exploited by people that benefit from conflict and benefit from repression. So now what we need to do is mobilize a movement of people that can counter that. Just like the solution to hate speech is not less speech, it's more speech. The solution to technology creating repression and creating violence is more technology that promotes cooperation, conflict resolution, understanding, and freedom. So that's what we need to invest in. And if we can put a price tag on that, we can turn the corner.
Okay, we're going to make that our last word. I've just failed because you can't ask any questions. They're pulling us off the stage. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much.